Okay, so now we're going to look at factors. So this is something that tends to confuse people, at least initially, and I think part of it is because there's not really like a good surrogate or similar data structure like in Python or other languages. Effectively, a factor is just it's a string, but there's a set number of allowed values. So it's basically types, right? So you could think of it as like types for like nominal data or like categories or something. One thing that is different in terms of how it's stored is that each of the allowed factor levels, so that they call them levels, they're actually assigned a numeric value that's associated with each of the allowed levels. So they do operate a little bit differently than like just a character string. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So here is a setup here. So what I'm doing is I'm using this rep, which is like replicate. So I'm basically taking the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, and I'm gonna create a bunch of like replicates of them. So there's gonna be 1,500 total, and then at different proportions for each one. So basically, I'm just creating a repeating characters, right? So let's just print that, or let's just do that first, and then we'll move on from there. So I'm gonna dump that down here, run that. If I do ACK year, you can see I've got a bunch of these repeating values. Now to turn that into a factor, what I'm basically doing is I'm just wrapping it inside of this factor function and setting it equal to a new variable. So before I move on from that, let me just clear the console here. If I do levels of ACK year, I should get back null, I believe. I do. And that's because it's not a factor, it's just a bunch of character strings. Now once I run this, I create a copy of that is going to act like a factor by just using the factor function here. And then if I do levels of ACK year, then ACK year 2, the new one, then it's going to print those back. So one thing you might notice here, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is that it puts the levels in just like alphabetical order. But for this case, since it's academic year, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Instead, we probably would want to have them like in the chronological order, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Note that if you don't know if something's a factor, you can do this is.factor. There's a lot of these is.arguments arguments in R that are effectively tests, right? To test whether something is a specific type of object. So if we run this, it should return true because that is a factor. If we run it on the original one, that before we convert to a factor, it should return false. So there are also functions like is.numeric, is.character, is.date, is.boolean, is.dataframe, things like that. So those are useful for like checking and testing things. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you may want to actually have your factors be in a specific order, and this is helpful if you want to like have a graph and then be in the correct order in the graph, so on and so forth. So to do that, whenever you convert something to a factor, you can set order as equal to true, and then you can provide it a list of levels. So here I'm basically doing the same thing I did above with the factor function, but now I'm saying order is equal to true, and then I'm giving it the levels inside of a combine here for the levels parameter. So basically I'm saying take these values, convert them into a factor, but I want them to be ordered, and this is the order that I want them in, and then I print the levels. So now if we print that, we should get back freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, graduate. So we get back the levels that we want. Sometimes whenever you like subset data, you'll have an issue where it still maintains the levels even if those levels are no longer in the subset. So in this example, I'm pulling out only the senior and the graduate rows, or I guess rows in this case, they're just individual values because it's a vector. So if I ran levels on that, you would expect it just to return now senior and graduate because those are the only records in the subset. But as you can see here, it actually returns all of them. So it returns all the original factor levels, even though only 2 of them are in the subset of the data. So that's what this drop levels function is for. If you run it, it'll get rid of factor levels that are not used. So if I run drop levels on that, and then check, I get back just senior and graduate. That can be a very common problem whenever you're like trying to read in data, or like using certain functions in R. It'll think that there should be there are like no examples of a factor level in the data set, and that's because you got rid of those all the values from that factor level, or records from that factor level. So you need to tell it to just like not to no longer include that as a level, right? So that's what the drop levels is for.